The village of Eldermere lay nestled between rolling hills and vast golden fields, a place where time moved at its own unhurried pace. Dusty roads wound between cottages of stone and timber, each home standing as a testament to generations of tradition. Here, life followed an unspoken rhythm: birth, marriage, work, and finally, the quiet embrace of old age. For the villagers, any deviation from this path was met with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. And in the heart of this unyielding world lived Miriam Fletcher, a woman of quiet resilience, a widow of nearly a decade, and the keeper of secrets that not even time could erode. Miriam was 58 but carried herself with a grace that made age irrelevant. Her silver-streaked hair was always neatly braided, her hands strong from years of labor yet gentle enough to heal. The women of Eldermere sought her remedies for their ailments, and the children knew her as the kind soul who never turned them away, even when their mothers warned them to keep their distance. She was respected, even admired, but not entirely accepted. For all her kindness, Miriam remained an outsider in the village she had called home for 30 years. Perhaps it was because she had not been born there, arriving only after marrying William Fletcher, a man much older than her but kind beyond measure. His death had left her untethered, a woman without a place in a community where a widow's grief was expected to be short-lived, and her usefulness even shorter. She had no interest in remarrying, no desire to bind herself to another man out of necessity. Instead, she had found solace in her work, her books, and in the rare letters from her son, Daniel, who had long since abandoned village life for the city. It was a cool autumn evening when the first whisper of change arrived. Miriam had just returned from tending to a sick child when she saw him, a stranger standing near the edge of town, his gaze lingering on the landscape as though he were searching for something. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark, contemplative eyes and an air of quiet solitude. His clothes, though simple, spoke of a life beyond Eldermere. The villagers were quick to notice him, their curiosity sharpening into suspicion. Strangers were rare in Eldermere, and rarer still were those who chose to stay. But stay he did. He rented a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, keeping mostly to himself, save for the occasional visit to the general store. His name, as Miriam later learned, was Lucas Whitmore, and he had come looking for peace. For weeks, the village hummed with speculation. Who was he? What did he want? Was he running from something? A man with no wife, no children, no past that anyone could uncover. Such a thing was unnatural in Eldermere. Miriam, however, watched without judgment. She understood the weight of solitude and the sting of being scrutinized for merely existing. Their first conversation was brief, born out of necessity rather than intent. Lucas had injured his hand while chopping wood, and with no one else willing to offer aid, he had come to Miriam. She cleaned the wound in silence, her practiced hands working swiftly as he sat at her kitchen table, observing the small details of her home, the stacks of books, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the single untouched chair across from his own. "You live alone," he remarked, more a statement than a question. "I do," Miriam replied, wrapping a bandage around his palm. "And you?" "I suppose I do too." A shared understanding passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of lives lived on the fringes. It was not a friendship, not yet, but it was something. As the weeks stretched into months, their encounters became more frequent. They spoke of books, of philosophy, of the world beyond the village. Unlike the others, Lucas did not ask her why she had never remarried, why she had chosen solitude over comfort. And unlike the others, Miriam did not press him for the reasons he had come to Eldermere. But the village was watching. They saw the way Lucas lingered near Miriam's garden, the way she allowed him into her home when she had allowed no other man before. The whispers began as murmurs, then grew into something louder, something darker. It was unnatural, they said. A woman of her age should not be keeping the company of a man so much younger. It was indecent, improper. Miriam ignored them, as she had ignored many things over the years. But she felt the shift. The way the market grew quieter when she entered, the way conversations halted when she passed. Even the children who once ran to her door hesitated now, their mothers pulling them away with tight-lipped warnings. And then, the first stone was thrown. It was small, more a pebble than a weapon, but the message was clear. It landed at her feet one evening as she stood outside her home, the echo of childish laughter fading into the night. Miriam bent to pick it up, turning it over in her palm, feeling the weight of it in more ways than one. She thought of Daniel, of how much she had given to this village, of the years she had spent healing their wounds, bringing their children into the world, easing their pain. And now, for what? A few stolen conversations with a man they barely knew? A storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind whispered through the trees. Something was about to change, something irreversible. And though Miriam had spent a lifetime preparing for solitude, she was not prepared for what would come next. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the sky still painted in the soft hues of dawn when Miriam stepped outside. The village was waking, the distant clatter of carts rolling over uneven roads, the rhythmic creak of wooden doors opening to greet the day. It should have been like any other morning, ordinary, predictable. But something felt different. The air carried an unease, a tension just beneath the surface, like the heavy stillness before a storm. Miriam had long learned to trust her instincts, and today they whispered a warning. She walked toward the market, her basket in hand, nodding politely at the few villagers she passed. Their responses were muted, their eyes avoiding hers. A coldness had settled in their gazes, one she recognized well. It was the look people wore before a judgment was cast, before words sharpened into weapons. As she stepped into the square, the murmurs began, low, urgent, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. They spread from stall to stall, passed between hands exchanging bread and coin, between mothers whispering behind raised palms. Miriam ignored it at first, accustomed to the idle gossip that often trailed behind her. But then, one word reached her ears, spoken with such venom that it made her steps falter. Pregnant. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. She turned sharply, searching the faces around her, but no one would meet her gaze. The whispers grew louder, feeding on her silence, twisting into something cruel. She's too old. How could it be? Disgusting, unnatural. Who's the father? That young man? That stranger? The weight of their words pressed against her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her basket, knuckles white. This was not just gossip. This was accusation. A shadow moved toward her, deliberate and slow. Margaret Holloway, a woman whose voice held more power in Eldermere than any decree, stepped forward, her expression carved from stone. She had been the first to welcome Miriam when she had arrived in the village as a young bride, and over the years, the warmth between them had cooled into something distant, something laced with quiet resentment. Miriam met her gaze, steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Is it true?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp as a blade. Miriam's heart pounded. She should deny it, should laugh at the absurdity of it. But she knew the village well enough to understand. Denial would only fan the flames. She held her silence. The crowd took it as confirmation. A murmur rippled through them, growing louder, more frantic. The market, which had moments ago been bustling with the simple trade of goods, had transformed into something else entirely, a court, a spectacle. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her like a noose tightening around her throat. A child giggled somewhere in the distance, oblivious to the venom that poisoned the air. Miriam forced herself to breathe. And then, another voice. "When were you planning to tell me?" The crowd parted, and there he was, Daniel. Her son. He had not written, had not visited in nearly a year. But now, here he stood, his face carved with disbelief, with anger. Miriam's fingers curled against her palm. The sight of him filled her with a strange mix of relief and dread. She had longed to see him, had spent countless nights wondering if he thought of her at all. But not like this. Not under the weight of scandal, Daniel, she started, but he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. This can't be true, he said, but there was no certainty in his voice. Only desperation. Tell me it's not true. Miriam opened her mouth, but no words came. His hands clenched into fists. Mother, this is insanity. Do you have any idea what they're saying? What they're accusing you of? The village held its breath, waiting for her response. She could end this now. She could tell them what they wanted to hear, spin a tale that would settle their restless minds. But she didn't. Instead, she turned her gaze to the villagers, to Margaret, to the faces that had once smiled at her, now twisted with judgment. She saw their fear, their need to place blame, to find something, or someone, to cast out in order to reassure themselves that the world still made sense. A bitter smile ghosted her lips. Believe what you want, she said, her voice quiet, yet it carried through the market like a bell tolling in the distance. The crowd erupted. Margaret's face darkened. You have disgraced yourself, she spat. At your age? Carrying a child by a man young enough to be your son? It is an abomination. Miriam did not flinch. She had been called many things in her life, too young, too old, too different. She had endured whispers behind her back, had learned to exist in the spaces between acceptance and exile. But this was something else. This was a noose tightening, a fire waiting for kindling. And then, Lucas. He stepped into the market square, his presence igniting a fresh wave of murmurs. His gaze swept over the crowd, then settled on Miriam. There was no shock in his eyes, no confusion. Only understanding. Someone in the crowd growled, "You should leave, boy. This is not your concern." But Lucas did not move. Daniel turned to him, his face twisted with suspicion, with betrayal. "Is it you?" he demanded. "Are you the father?" Silence fell like a blade. Miriam held her breath. Lucas, calm and unreadable, did not answer. And in that moment, Miriam knew, this was only the beginning. The weight of silence was suffocating. The market square, once alive with the sounds of trade and chatter, had become a courtroom. Eyes bore into Miriam with a force that could have shattered stone. Lucas stood beside her, his face unreadable, but his presence only seemed to fuel the villagers' fury. The accusation hung in the air like a noose, waiting to tighten. Daniel's breathing was heavy, his hands trembling at his sides. His mother's silence had only deepened his confusion, his anger. He had come expecting warmth, maybe even regret for his long absence. Instead, he had found his mother at the center of a scandal so unthinkable it made his skin crawl. "This is madness," he said, his voice hoarse. "You won't even deny it?" Miriam met his gaze, and for the first time in years, she saw the boy he used to be, scared, desperate for something solid to hold onto. But what could she give him? The truth, as it stood, would only feed the flames. "Daniel," she said softly, "not everything needs an answer." His jaw tightened. "It does when the whole village is calling you a disgrace." Margaret Holloway stepped forward, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as though shielding herself from contamination. "The boy deserves to know, Miriam," she said, voice dripping with self-righteous pity. "If you truly cared for your son, you wouldn't let him suffer your shame." Miriam turned to her, her patience thinning. "And what shame is that, Margaret?" Margaret's lips pressed into a hard line. "A woman of your age. A man like him." She flicked her gaze to Lucas, who remained impassive. "It is unnatural. Ungodly." The murmurs rose again. Miriam could feel the tide turning against her, no longer just whispers but a force gaining momentum, ready to swallow her whole. Then came the first betrayal. A woman she had once helped, and Wells, stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with the fire of the righteous. "We trusted you," she said. "You brought our children into this world, but what kind of example are you setting?" Miriam's chest tightened. She had been there when Anne's first child had struggled to breathe, had sat by her bedside when fever threatened to steal her second. And now, here she stood, casting stones. Hypocrisy is a comfortable thing, isn't it? Miriam said, voice even, and recoiled as though struck. "Aye. Enough," Margaret cut in. "The elder council must hear of this." Miriam let out a breath. Of course. They wanted a trial, a public reckoning. Daniel, still reeling, turned to Lucas. "And you," he said, fists clenched. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Lucas studied him, then the village, then Miriam. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the tension twist itself into knots. Then, quietly, he said, "Because the truth is not for them." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "So you admit it?" Lucas didn't answer. The silence was a verdict of its own. The village had what it needed. Miriam knew what would come next. They would not drive her out immediately. That was not how Eldermere worked. First, they would break her. Isolation. Condemnation. And if that did not suffice, if she remained standing despite their efforts, then they would force her out with stones, with fire, with every ugly thing they had kept buried beneath their polite exteriors. That night, the first sign of her punishment arrived. A smear of red paint on her door, crude letters spelling witch. It had been years since she had heard that word spoken in anything but whispers. It was the kind of accusation that lived in the bones of villages like Eldermere, ancient, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The villagers would never admit to believing in such things, not in the daylight, but in the dark. In the dark, fear had a way of twisting into something violent. Miriam stood before the painted word, fingers brushing against the rough wood. She had always known this place was never truly hers. The next day, the market was closed to her. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly turned away, their hands suddenly busy rearranging goods that did not need arranging. She walked through town like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only by the cold hush that followed her. Even those she had thought stronger, women she had called friends, kept their heads down, unwilling to meet her eyes. Except one. Elena. She was a girl of 16, not yet hardened by the village's rigid laws of propriety. She stood outside Miriam's home at dusk, a basket of bread and tea clutched in her small hands. "I don't believe them," she said as Miriam opened the door. Miriam smiled, though her heart ached. "You should go home, Elena." "I don't want to." The girl stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Miriam shut the door behind her, knowing this act of kindness would not go unnoticed. "Is it true?" Elena asked after a long silence. "About you and Lucas?" Miriam sighed, sitting down at the worn wooden table. "Does it matter?" Elena frowned. "It matters to them." Miriam studied the girl, the sincerity in her eyes, the fire of youth untainted by the fear that gripped the rest of the village. "Then let them believe what they wish," Miriam said at last. Elena bit her lip, as though debating whether to speak again. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They say they're going to the council." Miriam nodded. "I know. They're saying you should be made to leave." Miriam had expected as much. Elena hesitated, then reached across the table, her fingers curling over Miriam's. "I won't let them." Miriam's throat tightened. It was a simple gesture, but it was more kindness than she had been shown in weeks. But the village had already decided. And even the smallest kindness would not stop what was coming. The sky hung low and gray over Eldermere as the council gathered in the square, their expressions as cold as the wind that swept through the village. The villagers stood clustered together, wrapped in their cloaks, their murmurs a quiet storm waiting to break. Miriam stood alone. No chains bound her, no guards flanked her, but she was a prisoner all the same. Daniel stood to the side, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had pleaded with her to deny it, to say something, anything, to make this end. But she had only given him silence. A mother's love did not always come in words. Lucas was there, too, his posture straight, his face unreadable. He had not fled, despite the danger. Perhaps that was the only thing that had kept the villagers from dragging Miriam from her home in the dead of night. Margaret Holloway stepped forward, the wind catching the edges of her dark shawl, making her look like a vulture poised over prey. "Miriam Fletcher," she called, her voice ringing out over the gathered crowd. You stand accused of deception, of immoral conduct, of bringing shame upon this village. Do you deny these charges? The village held its breath. Miriam lifted her chin. I have done nothing but live my life. A scoff. A muttering of disapproval. Do you deny that you are carrying a child? Margaret pressed. Miriam let the question hang in the air. Then, slowly, she exhaled. I do not deny it. The words shattered through the crowd like a bolt of lightning. Gasps, murmurs, the rustling of fabric as people stepped back, as though afraid they might catch whatever wickedness they believed had tainted her. Daniel paled. Mother, no. Margaret's expression twisted with triumph. Then you admit to the disgrace you have brought upon us. Miriam turned her gaze to the council, to the elders who had watched her toil for decades, who had accepted her when it was convenient and cast her aside when it was not. I admit only that life is rarely as simple as you wish it to be, she said. Margaret's lips curled in disgust. And the father? The villagers turned their eyes to Lucas. He did not move, did not flinch beneath the weight of their suspicion. Then, finally, he spoke. It is not what you think. The statement was not a denial, nor was it an admission. It was a thread pulled loose from an unraveling tapestry, leaving more questions than answers. Margaret latched onto the ambiguity like a predator scenting weakness. You corrupt her with your presence, she spat. You came here, a stranger, and now look what you have done. Lucas took a step forward, and for the first time, there was something sharp in his expression, something that crackled beneath the surface like an ember waiting for breath. You call me the corruption, he said evenly, yet you stand here, condemning a woman who has done nothing but serve this village. You who came to her in sickness. You who sought her when your children burned with fever. You, who would have buried your own if not for the hands you now seek to cast out. A murmur rippled through the crowd, hesitation, the smallest seed of doubt. But Margaret would not let go so easily. She is nearly 60, she snapped. And yet she claims to bear a child. There is no science, no reason to such a thing. If this is not wickedness, what is it? Silence. And then laughter. Soft at first, then growing. Miriam turned toward the sound, and a figure emerged from the crowd, Dr. Edwin Graves, a man who had once lived in Eldermere but had left years ago for the city. His salt and pepper beard was fuller than she remembered, but his eyes still held the same quiet intelligence. He stepped forward, shaking his head. You superstitious fools, he said, amusement in his voice. You stir yourselves into a frenzy over something you do not understand. Margaret bristled. This is no laughing matter. Oh, but it is, Edwin interrupted smoothly. Because what you are condemning is not a miracle, nor a curse. He turned to Miriam, his gaze softening. It is medicine. A hush fell over the square. Edwin gestured toward Miriam. She is not with child. She is ill. A stunned silence followed. Miriam inhaled sharply. She had suspected something had changed within her body, but she had never dared to name it. Edwin continued, his voice measured. A rare condition, fibroids possibly, or something more severe. It causes swelling, changes in the body that can mimic pregnancy. But it is not. His gaze flickered to Margaret. And yet you were ready to cast her out, to burn her at the stake like a relic from the past. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no words. The villagers began to shift, uncomfortable, realization creeping in. The weight of their judgment, so righteous mere moments ago, now sat heavy on their shoulders. Daniel exhaled a shaky breath. So she's not. He looked at his mother, anguish and relief warring in his eyes. You're sick. Miriam met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. It seems so. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, the anger in her son's face cracked, giving way to something raw, something vulnerable. The villagers, faced with the truth of their own cruelty, began to step back. The whispers that had condemned her now turned inward. Lucas turned to Miriam, his expression soft. "Are you all right?" Miriam looked at him, at the man who had stood beside her when no one else had. Then at Daniel, whose presence, however delayed, meant more than she could put into words. She straightened her shoulders. "I will be." The storm had passed, leaving behind only wreckage. But wreckage could be rebuilt. The village no longer whispered when Miriam passed. Instead, there was silence, a heavy, lingering quiet that held more weight than words ever could. Some could not meet her gaze, shame resting on their shoulders like an old, worn coat. Others offered small, hesitant nods, as if those fleeting gestures could erase the cruelty of their judgment. But Miriam did not seek apologies. Some wounds could not be undone with regret alone. Daniel had not left her side since the council had disbanded. Guilt clung to him, unspoken yet evident in the way he watched her, in the way his hands hovered near hers as if afraid to touch, as if touch alone could mend the distance between them. He had let the village's whispers become his truth, had doubted her when she needed him most. Now, that knowledge haunted him. Miriam, however, carried no resentment toward her son. He was still learning, still trying to understand the complexities of a world that often demanded certainty where none existed. She knew the weight of shame, of feeling like one had failed the people they loved. It was not a burden she wished upon him. Lucas left the village at dawn. He did not say goodbye, did not linger at her door with parting words. He simply disappeared into the mist, his presence fading as quietly as it had arrived. Miriam had not expected him to stay. His purpose had never been to belong, only to stand when it mattered. She would remember him not as the man the village condemned, but as the one who had refused to bend beneath its weight. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence between them. "Mother," he said, hesitating before lowering himself onto the wooden chair across from her. The fire between them crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. "I should have been here." Miriam studied him, the flicker of remorse in his features, the weariness in his eyes. He looked like his father in moments like this, too proud to beg for forgiveness yet aching for it nonetheless. "You are here now," she said simply. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I thought I knew you. I thought I understood the kind of person you were. But when they started saying those things, I didn't know what to believe." Miriam set down the tea she had been cradling, the warmth lingering against her palms. "People fear what they cannot explain," she said. "Even you." He flinched but did not argue. "I let them fill my head with doubt," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "And I was angry. Not just because of what they were saying, but because I didn't know you anymore." He swallowed hard. "I thought leaving would make it easier. That if I built a life far away, I wouldn't have to." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to see you grow old." Miriam's breath caught. "I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid that one day I would come back and you'd be gone." The truth settled between them, raw and aching. Miriam reached across the table, her fingers finding his. He did not pull away. "Time does not ask for permission, Daniel," she said gently. "It does not wait until we are ready." His grip tightened slightly, as if grounding himself in the feel of her touch. "I don't want to waste what's left." A soft smile tugged at her lips. "Then don't." And just like that, the past was not erased but softened, reshaped into something they could hold without breaking beneath its weight. The days that followed were quieter. The village, humbled by its mistakes, allowed her to move through its streets without fear. Some offered kindness in small ways, a fresh loaf of bread left at her doorstep, a bouquet of wildflowers resting on her window sill. It was their way of atonement, though few had the courage to voice it. Miriam did not turn them away. Forgiveness, after all, was not about forgetting. It was about choosing not to let bitterness take root where healing could grow. The rumors faded with time, as all things did. The village would find something else to speak of, some new scandal to dissect with eager tongues. But Miriam would not be a part of it. Not anymore. She spent her mornings in the garden, hands in the soil, feeling the earth beneath her fingertips. The days stretched ahead of her, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long while, she did not fear what lay beyond the horizon. Daniel stayed. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough to know her again. Long enough to remember why he had once called this place home. When he finally left, it was not in anger but with a promise. "I will return," he said, and this time she believed him. As she watched him disappear down the road, the sun casting long shadows in his wake, Miriam inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of the earth, of the village, of everything she had built and everything she had survived. She was still here. And that was enough.